topic is listed as would like to prove the historicity of Jesus.
You did call in on the right
And
day.
you couldn't have called it a more perfect day.
It's an atheist miracle.
So you're on with Tracy and David, and feel free. Go ahead.
Well, I'm not an expert in textual criticism, but I don't know, where do you want to start off with, the Gospels or outside of the Bible for Jesus's existence?
Well,
let me ask you this.
Go for it, David.
I mentioned this in the talk today, is the first thing we should ask ourselves anytime someone wants to tell you, oh, I know what Jesus said or did or how he wants you to vote, you need to say, okay, well, what's our source for that? And then you have to say, how reliable is that source? So I guess that's what I would put to you is, what's your sources for anything you want to make that claim about Jesus, and how reliable are those sources?
Well, for example, if you look at the emperor at the time of Jesus, he has only 10 historical sources in the first, after the 150 years of his life. But when we look at Jesus, we have 42.
Hold on, stop, pump the brakes. When you say we have 42, first of all, that number is widely inflated. How many contemporary witnesses do we have to Jesus? How many non-Christian witnesses do we have to Jesus? That's a better question, because it turns out of all the lines of evidence that you can use to prop up any historical claim, not even about Jesus, but about anybody, John the Baptist, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, you've got to ask yourself, how many lines of evidence do we have to support this? And when you look at just the ways that you can support a claim, for most of those lines of evidence, Jesus has exactly 0 lines of evidence. And the one that he does have, which is, it's not the best kind of written evidence. It's not historians citing their sources and giving, critiquing views and weighing the evidence. It's the worst kind. It's anonymous Christian writers falsely passing themselves off as somebody who existed years before them and from some other place, who are writing specifically without sources, claiming to be eyewitnesses, claiming to be talking to eyewitnesses, who are out there writing all this to convert you to Christianity. It's hard that are in a worse shape for Jesus. And that's true whether Jesus was real or not. The fact is, even if there was a Jesus, just weighing the state of the evidence we have for him, it almost doesn't even matter, because everything that we think we know about Jesus comes from sources that have nothing to do with anybody who actually lived in the first century.
Okay, if you want to start with Pontius Pilate, we found his grave.
Pontius Pilate existed.
Correct. He's correct. Now I'll go to...
In fact, it's what we know about Pontius Pilate that helps us tell that the stories they're telling about him in the Gospels don't match historical reality, because the Pontius Pilate they paint a picture of is nobody who actually existed. Because we have lots of good sources on Pontius Pilate, and they all disagree with what the Gospels are saying about him.
Well, we'll start with the Gospel of John. You don't believe John the Apostle wrote that?
No, I don't think there was a John the Apostle. And actually, the real author of that isn't given as John the Apostle. It's given as the beloved disciple, the disciple who Jesus loved. And in fact, there's scholars out there who think it's actually the character of Lazarus who's supposed to be the beloved disciple, because that's the only other person in there that it specifically mentions Jesus loving. But it's funny you say let's start with John, because John is actually the last gospel to be written. And he's writing sometime in the early 2nd century. If you wanted to start with a gospel, we should start with the Gospel of Mark, because that was the first gospel that was written. And when it was written sometime right after the war with Rome, around in the 70s of the 1st century. All our biographical information ultimately comes from the 4 Gospels, and all our 4 Gospels ultimately come from that Gospel of Mark.
Well, I disagree with that, because Mark, Luke, and Matthew are considered the synoptic Gospels.
That is exactly. You know what that means? John, wait, let's break that down for our audience. What that means that they're called the synoptic Gospels, because I think
yes, I could explain that.
Please do.
Most of the parables, most of the miracles, most of Jesus' life in Luke, Matthew, and what are we talking about? Luke,
Matthew,
and Mark. Those are like, you got 30 of the same stories in those, because Mark was written for the Romans, Luke was written for the Greeks, and Matthew was written for the Jews. The reason Matthew was written for the Jews is because it's got most of the Old Testament prophecies in there.
And he also corrects most of Mark's mistakes, whereas Luke tends to repeat them.
But I wanted to talk about something in John that's very specific, that I know that this is an eyewitness testimony.
That's funny you say that, because even the Gospel of John says that we know this is true even though we're not eyewitnesses. But go ahead. I think I know where you're going with this.
But do you know what a pleural effusion is?
Let's come back to your synoptic problem first. But no, go ahead and tell us all what pleural infusion is.
Well, in John 19:34, it says, when Jesus was dead, the guy put a spear into his lung, and a bunch of blood and water came out.
Yeah.
Very specific, very specific.
And very hard.
But
in reality, how would you know if blood and water came out at the same time? Just putting it out there.
Because we can now confirm this with medical evidence.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that medically it can't be done. What I'm saying is, if you are an ancient person poking a hole into somebody and they say blood and water came out, how would an ancient person know that that was happening? Metaphorically and allegorically, it makes a lot of sense for a later writer like John to be saying that that's what happened, because there's metaphorical weight to water and metaphorical weight to blood that he's drawing upon. But anyway, we're talking about a story. You're talking about, I'm not denying that that could happen or possibly happen, but the possibility of that happening isn't what's making it true or not, and it's certainly not making it an eyewitness account. And in fact, the fact that it has to go out of its way from later editors to end the story and say, oh, and this was written by an eyewitness, and we know it's true because it says right here. The napkin religion is true because it says right here on the napkin. That's what we get at the end of John. And again, this is being written by somebody in the mid to early 2nd century. It could not have been written by anybody who was alive when Jesus was alive.
I disagree, because the reason why we Protestants don't include the apocryphal books, which also give historical evidence for Jesus, is because those were written after 100 AD.
Well, that's not why, but and anyway, I'm finally, you're saying, your point, it seems the point you're making is that, well, because this thing medically is real, that means this story actually happened. And I'm not sure I follow that at all.
But you're suggesting that if I made up a story that water came out of
No, not you, but I'm suggesting, yes, it was a story, and we have many lines of evidence that point to this being a story. In fact, we can trace out the evolution of this story. And I said, let's start with Mark, because Mark is the oldest gospel, and we can trace out where Matthew spins off from Mark, where Luke spins off from Mark, where John spins off from them. And when they're not in lockstep with each other, quoting word for word in ways that are very unlikely if they were even trying to tell the same story, because again, it's word for word, verbatim correspondence. When they're not in lockstep with each other, they're going off in completely incompatible ways. I was just telling Tracy about that, how if you read the details in John's gospel about the last 3 weeks of Jesus' life, and then compare it to any of the synoptic gospels, they don't match up at all, not even a little bit. They're completely detailed, completely filled in, and they're completely incompatible. And I'm talking about not just after the resurrection, which is they are, but I'm talking about for the final month of Jesus' life, they've got their Jesus doing completely different things in completely different ways for completely different motives.
Well, Mark was written first for the Romans, so.
Well, Mark was written first, full stop. He wrote it for Gentile Christians. He may have written it in Rome. He certainly didn't write it in Judea or the Galilee, because he makes all of these mistakes about everyday life in Judea and basic Judaism that nobody would have made if they were actually the person he was supposed to be in the Bible. Matthew goes and takes his Bible. None of these guys were setting out to write a gospel. They were all setting out to write the gospel. Matthew was just trying to take the only gospel he knew, Mark's, and improve on it, add to it, and correct its mistakes. And where Mark keeps alluding to Old Testament passages, Matthew makes that explicit. Mark expects his more educated readers to understand what he's doing and that he's telling a story about Jesus, but he's really telling parables taken from Old Testament scriptures. And things that don't make sense historically, they don't make sense from a logical standpoint, they make perfect sense from an allegorical standpoint. And Mark actually goes out of his ways to tell us that's what he's doing. Whereas Matthew, as you say, written for the Jews, and I totally agree, he was written for Jewish Christians in a Jewish Christian community. Luke, on the other hand, he was writing for everybody. He wanted to be a big tent writer. He wanted Christianity to include women and children and Gentiles and Pharisees and the John the Baptist cult. He wanted to make these all part of the same team. So that when he's writing his gospel, and interesting, when he writes his gospel, he says, you know, there's so many people writing gospels now, it seemed to me a good idea to go back to our sources and check in this story that was handed down to us, which is a lie, because all he does is take the best parts of Matthew and Mark and then spin off from there. He doesn't tell us that's what he's doing. It's very clear from the textual analysis that's exactly what he's doing. And he's also taking things from Josephus. And the reason we know he's taking things from Flavius Josephus is because when we match those up, the information we get in Josephus is more complete, it's in context, and it makes sense, whereas he's clearly just using bits of it for window dressing and not always getting his facts right, which is one of the ways that we know that he's the one stealing from Josephus and not the other way around. And John, of course, comes decades later, if not more than that. And again, he's writing at a time when his Jesus is so much different from Mark's Jesus that you can barely think that they were the same character. In Mark's Jesus, he is the most fallible, most human, the most no-frills Jesus. John's Jesus should have been stoned to death for blasphemy 2 minutes out of the gate. There's no reason that they shouldn't have killed him because he's constantly saying that he's God. He might as well be wearing it on a t-shirt. It's like there was a shortage of rocks around that time. Otherwise, they would have taken him right out as Mosaic law required.
Well, you're suggesting that Mark is not a eyewitness testimony.
No, I'm not suggesting it. I'm saying it outright. There is no way he was an eyewitness. He doesn't claim to be an eyewitness.
I did because in Galatians 2:9, James, Peter, and John are the esteemed pillars of the Christian church.
And let's look at those pillars. What does Paul say about those guys that are the pillars of the church in Galatians?
Can I just say Mark the evangelist who wrote Mark gets his information from Peter. So
you know, if that was true, then why do the other Gospels have more information about Peter than Mark's does?
Because Mark is a basic summary of Jesus' life.
How do you know that? Why would you even say that? What makes you think it's a basic summary of Jesus' life?
First of all, we have 4 different Gospels, and they're written for different people to get people to Christ. We don't have just one book. Because if we did write one book, you would just criticize that anyways. Well,
I probably would, because it probably would have something to criticize about it. But the fact is, we didn't have 4 Gospels for the longest time. In fact, we had dozens of Gospels, really. But the fact is, it wasn't until the middle of the 2nd century that anyone thought, you know what? We should put all these letters together and all these Gospels together and sort out the ones we like from the ones we don't like and make a New Testament out of it. And you know where they got that idea? They got that idea from heretics, Marcion. We didn't have the printing press. We didn't have the printing press till 1500. Didn't say we had the printing press. Write down. Didn't say we had the printing press. But they got the idea to collect these letters and these books and put them into a collection of Scripture. They got that idea from Marcion, and we're talking about the 2nd century now. Up till then, up to the time of Paul, before Paul, it never occurred to anybody to put these writings together. So when you say these guys were writing their Gospels for different audiences, yeah, that's true. But that's true of dozens of Gospels. And all of these, though they were aimed at a specific target, like Matthew, he was a Jewish writer aiming for a Jewish community. Luke was a Gentile writer aiming for Gentiles. It wasn't like they were sorting out themselves to target, and we'd have all 4, and that would cover our target audience. No, every single one of them was writing the one true gospel. Luke even is right out of the gate says, so many people are writing gospels, I'm going to give you the true story. And then he besmirches his own sources, Matthew, Mark, and everybody else who's writing. And again, these are just the gospels that made the cut. They aren't including all the gospels we know about, and that's only including all the gospels that have survived to the day. So there's a world of Christian writings out there, early Christian writings, that never made it.
Well, we could start with, a lot of people don't know the history of the early Christian church.
You were preaching to the choir.
300 years, for the first 300 years of Christianity, it was considered a cult.
Absolutely. And it was a cult.
And these men sacrificed their lives.
Hang on, hold on.
Truth.
How do we know that? Who tells us that?
Well, we know James did because Josephus recorded that James died.
He records that a guy named James died, but if you've read my book Nailed, you'll know that that James is not the James that we think of as the leader of the Jerusalem church. That's a completely different James altogether.
We also found an artifact.
That's James the Just. It's not our Jesus. In fact, you only have to read the passage in Josephus to see that that's the case. That the James in that passage and the Jesus in that passage is James the Just and Jesus son of Damnius, the brother of the high priest. It's not that should be a no-brainer by this point, because you just have to read it to know that.
We have 24,000 copies of the New Testament.
You know, we could have 24 million copies and it wouldn't make any difference, because those 24,000 copies you're talking about are from the 12th century, 8th century, 10th century. When you want to talk about what really matters, it's not the amount of monks who are copying scripture. How many root manuscripts do we have? How many textual traditions do we have? When you start going back to that, what do we have from the 3rd century? What do we have from the 2nd century? What do we have from the 1st century? We have nothing at all from the 1st century. We have nothing but scraps for the majority of the 2nd century. We don't have complete books of the New Testament until the very end of the 2nd century. We don't have complete New Testaments until the 4th century. So there's a huge blackout period for the first 150 to 250 years of Christianity where we don't know if what we have matches the originals. We have no way of knowing if it matches the originals. And here's the thing. Let's say somebody put the original in a vault and it magically has been undisturbed until just now. If we found that manuscript and had it in our hands right now, we wouldn't know it was the original. We'd say, well, here's a weird heretical gospel.
Well, we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which proved the book of Isaiah was accurate.
Sorry. Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls do talk about Isaiah. Yep. And they also...
At least one book.
Well, and when you say accurate, Isaiah was written by 2 different people over 2 different times. And we can see that in the Dead Sea Scrolls too. And I don't know what it has to do with the New Testament, but there you go.
But we can trace all the New Testament books back to Jesus' inner circle.
No, we can't. No, we can't.
Yes, we can. If you look at Matthew, he was a tax collector. He talked about the temple tax in Matthew 17. He talked about the unforgiven servant in Matthew 18. And in Matthew 20, he talked about the parable of the workers in the vineyard.
And where is any of the gospel that it says this was written by Matthew?
Some strange God.
Where does it say anywhere in the gospel that this was written by Matthew? And we should say Matthew Levi because hang on a second. We should say Matthew Levi because in one gospel he's Matthew the tax collector, and the other one he's Levi, and it's been put together as Matthew Levi. But in the separate gospels, they're 2 separate characters. And in fact, when you take out all the apostles, including the ones who are evangelists, there is no single Christian document, full stop, that agrees on who the apostles were. Not a single one. They're all put together. They're all put together by slapping together the 4 gospels we like, and then saying, well, this guy must have had 2 or 3 names, and doing it from there. You mentioned the leaders of the Jerusalem church, and I wanted to come back to that because, yeah, we do have the leaders of the Jerusalem church, and you didn't answer my question. What does Paul say about those guys? Everyone says, oh, in Galatians, he says that James is the brother of the Lord. He's Jesus' brother. Well, no, he's not Jesus' brother. He's the brother of the Lord. And what does Paul say about him? He says all those guys are false Christians. He doesn't agree with them for a minute. The whole book of Galatians, the letter of Galatians, is talking about his run-in with these guys who he calls false Christians. How do you talk about Jesus as friends and family like this? It seems like all the arguments you're making are, well, the gospel says this, and therefore we know that. But you're not saying, well, who wrote these gospels? How do we know that Matthew wrote this gospel called Matthew? Because the gospel of Matthew doesn't say that Matthew, wrote this. In fact, it says things like, oh, and this story was told around, and the Jews believe it to this day. All the gospels have giveaways that there's anachronisms that they're writing long after the time they admit that the story is set in. It's like you're trying to say, well, Gandalf said that Frodo had the One Ring, so we know that was true.
Well, we know the Gospel of Matthew is correct because the massacre of the innocents, when Herod did that, when we look at sources outside of the Bible, it proves that he killed his own kids and one of his wives.
Well, he definitely killed his own kids and one of his wives, but we don't have we have no corroboration for the massacre of the innocents. And that's a very weird thing to leave out because the same guys who told us that he killed his wife and his sons, they loved picking dirt on Herod the Great. They would have no way they would have missed something like, oh, and he just happened to massacre all the boys born in Bethlehem for over 2 years. And honestly, if he did that, well, then how did John the Baptist survive? Because he was born around then too. But anyway, the point is, you say these things have historical corroboration. You can't point to the same book and say they have historical corroboration. And when you look at look at the corroboration, what they're corroborating is not what you say they are.
Tacitus mentions Jesus' crucifixion.
He mentions that Christians worship a guy that was crucified, and I think you're mentioning I think you're thinking of Suetonius too. But all these guys, and I go through all these alleged witnesses in my book, Nailed. In every single case, we're talking about 2nd and 3rd century figures talking about Christians and what Christians are saying. And Bart Ehrman, who's he's with you that there was a real Jesus, even he says, and he's talking about the Josephus testimonium in particular, he says, you know what, even if every word of this is true, and we know it's not because it's a forgery, it doesn't add anything to the question because this is nothing except what Christians were saying, or any Christian on the street was saying. We know Tacitus wasn't going through the library to look up this stuff because he's not talking about Christians. He's talking about something else and just mentioning it to explain, okay, Christians, I should explain what these are because you've never heard of them. They worship this crucified guy, blah, blah, blah. Some of your fellow Christian apologists bring out eyewitnesses that if they read these supposed eyewitnesses, not only would they see that these are not eyewitnesses, often they're not even saying what you think they're saying, and they're saying things about Christianity that does not make early Christianity look good. And I'm thinking of Lucian of Samosata. They say, oh, well, he mentions that Jesus was crucified. Yeah, he's a 4th century, 3rd century Jerry Seinfeld talking about how gullible the Christians are, and that how his friend Proteus, Peregrinus, wrote Christian scriptures, and they all fell for it. It's like, keep reading what these witnesses to what you're saying say.
I'm going to have to insert here that we do have other callers on the line, but Andrew has not gotten much talk time. Okay. So what I'd like to do...
Well, I just want to say, and Andrew, if you want to talk more about this offline...
Let's finish off with it.
Well, if you want to talk more about this offline, please
Well, that's what I was going to suggest.
Can I just get a couple of things here?
Sure, you get a couple of things.
One question.
I've talked a lot over him, sure, I guess.
Does he believe the Roman Emperor Tiberius existed?
Duh. Why would I not believe that? Let me put it this way. We have good lines of evidence that indicate Tiberius existed.
But we only have 10 historians that recognize him within the one.
That's not all we have.
And we have
even if that was the only written evidence we have, that's not the only evidence we have.
If Jesus was just a carpenter from Nazareth, why do we have 42 independent sources that recognize his identity?
Short answer, we don't. Long answer, because they started a religion about it. But those 42 witnesses that you're lined up, none of them are from his life. None of them are from the 1st century. Almost all of them are after the fact, and almost all of them are Christian.
All right, I'm grabbing the reins here.
Okay.
And I'm going to say, would you...
Can I just ask him one more question?
No, because then he'll give you an answer.
You can just give me a quick...
What I'd like...
Does he believe
Wait. Please let me just insert my solution here so that we can move on to another call. What I was going to do is ask David, would you be amenable to engaging at our blog with the people who might have questions for you about the conversations today?
It would be my happy
I just
privilege
wanna
to do
ask-
that.
Okay,
more
so
questions,
Andrew,
and then
you can
make-
ask David questions at the blog. I'm going to just warn people.
And everyone can see it on the blog?
Yeah, it's going to be visible on the blog. So, Andrew, you're welcome to come. There's an open show thread at the Atheist Experience blog that will be specifically for this show. You can go and post your questions to David, and David has agreed to answer them. And I will let you know that if you have not posted to our blog before, the first comment that you post has to be moderated, so there may be a delay. So if you go to post and you don't see your post immediately appear, it's just because it needs moderation. When someone goes in and moderates it, then you will be able to post freely after that. Do you understand?
Yes.
Okay.
Does he believe Alexander the Great existed?
We've got good evidence for it.
This is more of the
We
same.
don't have any evidence of his life until 200 years after his death.
That's
We have
adorable.
42
That is adorable,
evidences
Andrew.
of Jesus.
Okay, Andrew, please post it at the blog, and David, please respond to him at the blog.
I promise I will. And I won't even be snarky about it. I won't even be snarky.
All right, and I didn't want to hang up on Andrew. I felt that Andrew was actually a polite caller. He was actually okay. This can't go on because it will be endless. So
This is my life.
It
This is
is.
my life. Yes.
So then
Down
we
the rabbit
have
hole we go.
Another